Hey everyone, tonight we're diving headfirst, or perhaps more accurately, gently wading into the rather fascinating world of ancient Mesoamerica. Picture this. You're not scrolling through your phone for the latest meme coin, but instead you're in a bustling marketplace, the air thick with the scent of unfamiliar spices, tropical flowers, and something else. Something rich, earthy, and a little bit bitter. That, my friends, is the aroma of money, because tonight we're exploring a time when chocolate, or more specifically the cacao bean, was a form of currency. Imagine paying your taxes in Tootsie Rolls or trying to break a $100 bill that's actually a giant Toblerone. You'd probably try to nibble your way out of debt, wouldn't you? Honestly, given how quickly a bag of M&Ms disappears in my house, you probably wouldn't last a day with an edible bank account. You'd be broke and slightly nauseous before lunchtime. It's a world away from our digital transactions and paper bills, a time when wealth literally grew on trees. So before you get too comfortable and drift off into dreams of chocolate rivers, which, by the way, would be a terrible idea, think of the viscosity, please do take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. No pressure, just good vibes and sleepy time stories. And hey, while you're at it, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's always a treat to see how far these little historical jaunts travel. Now, let's dim the lights, turn on your fan for that gentle white noise, and let's begin tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing at the edge of a sprawling marketplace, somewhere in the heart of what we now call Mesoamerica, perhaps around the 10th century. The sun, a relentless golden disk, beats down, but a gentle breeze rustles the vibrant awnings stretched between stalls, offering fleeting moments of shade. Your feet, clad in simple woven sandals, shuffle on the packed earth, already warm from the morning rays. The air hums with a chorus of sounds, the chatter of vendors calling out their wares in a melodic, unfamiliar tongue, the squawk of a brightly plumed macaw tethered to a perch, the rhythmic slap-slap of a woman patting out corn tortillas, and the distant, almost mournful call of a conch-shell trumpet, perhaps announcing the arrival of an important official or a new shipment of goods. You're not here as a tourist, not exactly. You're a part of this world, a trader perhaps, or maybe just someone with a few precious items to barter. Your eyes scan the kaleidoscope of goods on display. There are piles of fiery chilies in every imaginable shade of red, orange, and green. Pyramids of smooth, dark obsidian, its volcanic glass edges sharp enough to shave with. Intricately woven textiles dyed with colors so vivid they almost hurt your eyes. Cochineal red, indigo blue, and a brilliant sunny yellow. You see pottery, some plain and utilitarian, others adorned with complex geometric patterns or depictions of gods with fearsome jaguar snouts and feathered serpent bodies. It's a sensory overload, but in a strangely calming way. No blaring music, no frantic rush, just the steady rhythm of commerce and life. And then you see them, the cacao beans. They're not in big, obvious piles like the corn or the beans. No, these are treated with a certain reverence. They're often kept in small, lidded baskets, or perhaps spread out carefully on a clean mat, counted and recounted with focused attention. These aren't just the precursors to your favorite late-night snack. These are, quite literally, money. You watch as a man, his face weathered and intelligent, carefully selects a plump, ripe avocado. He offers the vendor a small handful of cacao beans. Maybe 10, maybe 15. There's a brief, quiet negotiation, a nod, and the transaction is complete. The vendor scoops the beans into a small pouch at his waist, his movements practiced and economical. It's a bit like seeing someone pay for their groceries with coffee beans, isn't it? Except these aren't just any beans. The cacao tree, Theobroma cacao, meaning food of the gods, was, and in many ways still is, a rather picky plant. It doesn't just grow anywhere. It needs a specific kind of tropical climate. Warm, humid, with plenty of shade. Think of it as the Goldilocks of the plant kingdom. Everything has to be just right. This inherent scarcity, this particularity, is one of the reasons its fruit, or rather the seeds within its fruit, became so valuable. You couldn't just wander into your backyard and pick a money tree unless you lived in a very specific, very fortunate, humid lowland region. This is a mainstream historical fact. The limited growing regions of cacao contributed significantly to its value as a commodity and, subsequently, as currency. You meander deeper into the market, the scents and sounds enveloping you. You notice a woman selling tamales wrapped in corn husks and steaming invitingly. She's asking for 2 cacao beans per tamale. A little further on, a craftsman is displaying beautifully polished jade ear spools. Those would cost you a significant sack of beans, probably several hundred, if not more, depending on the quality and size. It's a whole different economic system. No inflation rates to worry about in the Wall Street Journal, but you might worry about a sudden blight affecting the cacao crop or a neighboring ruler trying to corner the market on god food. Imagine the financial news. Cacao futures are down today due to an unexpected infestation of particularly hungry monkeys. You pause to watch a group of men, perhaps merchants from a more distant region. They're dressed differently, their cloaks more ornate, their speech carrying a different cadence. They're not just buying everyday goods, they seem to be negotiating a larger trade, bundles of exotic bird feathers, quetzal, macaw, for what looks like a substantial quantity of cacao, carefully bundled in standardized lots. This hints at the scale of this cacaonomic system. It wasn't just for buying your lunch. It facilitated regional trade, moved luxury goods, and likely funded a fair few political careers, just like any other currency. One of the weird little details about this whole system is how they dealt with counterfeiting. Yes, even with beans, people tried to cheat. An unscrupulous individual might try to pass off inferior beans, or even more deviously, they might hollow out cacao bean shells and fill them with dirt or clay, then reseal them to look like the real thing. Imagine biting into your change and getting a mouthful of mud. It certainly adds a new dimension to tasting your money. So, vendors became quite adept at inspecting beans, feeling their weight, checking their plumpness, sometimes even breaking one open if a batch looked suspicious. There were probably ancient Mesoamerican equivalents of those little counterfeit detector pens, but maybe it was just a really discerning thumbnail. You continue your slow walk. The sun is climbing higher and the market is reaching its peak activity. You see children, their eyes wide with the wonders around them, perhaps occasionally pilfering a fallen bean, only to be gently chided. You notice the social stratification. Some individuals are clearly wealthy, their garments finer, their demeanor more commanding, and the number of attendants fussing around them a dead giveaway. They're likely the ones controlling larger cacao orchards or managing the long-distance trade routes. Others are clearly more humble, offering perhaps a few handcrafted items or a bit of surplus from their small garden, hoping to earn enough beans for their family's immediate needs. Historians still debate the exact extent and uniformity of cacao as currency across all the diverse cultures of Mesoamerica. While it was certainly widespread among the Maya and later the Aztecs, or Mexica as they called themselves, the precise conversion rates, the degree to which it was used for all types of transactions, and how it coexisted with other forms of barter or tribute are still subjects of ongoing research. Did a common laborer get paid a daily wage in cacao beans? For some tasks, quite possibly. If you were a porter carrying goods for a merchant, you might receive a certain number of beans at the end of the day. How many beans for a turkey? That could vary by region, by season, and by the plumpness of the turkey. There wasn't a central Mesoamerican Federal Reserve setting the bean standard. It was a more organic, fluctuating system, much like early currency systems elsewhere in the world. Some scholars argue it was more of a high-value commodity used by elites for specific exchanges, while others believe it was more deeply embedded in everyday transactions for a broader segment of the population. The truth, as it often is, probably lies somewhere in between, varying across time and place. You drift towards a quieter section of the market where medicinal herbs are being sold. An old woman, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, each one telling a story, gestures towards her bundles of dried leaves, roots, and flowers. She explains, through a combination of gestures and the few words of her language you understand, that a particular root can soothe a fever, and she's asking for a modest 5 beans. It's fascinating to think that the same item used to buy a spicy tamale could also be used to acquire medicine, or to pay a tribute to a powerful ruler, or even, in some cultures, to be offered to the gods in sacred rituals. The cacao bean wasn't just a proto-Bitcoin, it was deeply interwoven with the cultural and spiritual life of Mesoamerican peoples. The frothy, often bitter drink made from these beans, zocolatl, was a luxury, an energizer, a ritual beverage. It wasn't the sweet, milky stuff we guzzle down today. Think more along the lines of an unsweetened, intense espresso, often spiced with chili, vanilla, or other local flavorings. The froth was particularly prized, achieved by pouring the liquid from one vessel to another from a height, a skill in itself. So, when you held a cacao bean, you weren't just holding potential purchasing power, you were holding a piece of something sacred, something divine. It makes our crumpled dollar bills and plastic cards seem rather mundane in comparison, doesn't it? Imagine if every time you tapped your credit card, you were also invoking a minor deity of commerce. Checkout lines would be a lot more interesting, or possibly terrifying. You find a spot in the shade of a large ceiba tree, its branches reaching towards the sky like gnarled fingers. You sit and watch the flow of people, the constant exchange of goods and beans. A dog, skinny and hopeful, sniffs around for dropped morsels. A group of warriors, their obsidian-edged clubs or makua heidel, resting on their shoulders, stride through the market with an air of authority, their presence a reminder of the power structures that underpinned this entire society. They aren't buying anything. They're likely part of the city-state's security, or perhaps collecting tribute, which would have often been paid in valuable goods, including, of course, cacao. Consider the logistics for a moment. If you're dealing with large quantities of cacao, how do you store it? How do you transport it without it spoiling or being stolen? The beans needed to be kept dry to prevent mold. They were often transported in sacks or baskets, carried by human porters. Remember, there were no draft animals like horses or oxen in Mesoamerica before the arrival of Europeans. So, if you were a wealthy merchant, your bank might be a series of well-guarded storehouses, and your armored trucks would be a caravan of strong individuals trekking over difficult terrain. It was a physically demanding enterprise. Can you imagine the backbreaking labor involved in carrying, say, the equivalent of a lord's annual tax revenue in beans across 50 miles of jungle and mountains? Makes you appreciate direct deposit. You notice a vendor selling small clay figurines. Some are animals, jaguars, eagles, snakes. Others are human-like, perhaps representing ancestors or deities. He's asking only a few beans for each, a small indulgence. You pick one up, a little ocarina shaped like a turtle. You hand over 3 cacao beans. They feel smooth and light in your palm before you pass them to him. He nods, his eyes crinkling at the corners. It's a simple exchange, yet it connects you directly to this ancient economy, this food of the gods that also served as the grease for the wheels of daily life. It's important to remember that the Mesoamerican world wasn't a single monolithic empire, especially during the earlier periods when cacao's use as currency was developing. It was a tapestry of different city-states, cultures, and languages. The Maya in the Yucatan and Highlands, the Zapotec in Oaxaca, later the Toltecs, and eventually the Aztecs dominating central Mexico. While they shared many cultural traits, including the importance of maize, the ritual ball game, and a complex pantheon of gods, there were also significant regional variations. So, the exact rules of the cacao economy likely differed from place to place. What might buy you a fine cotton mantle in a Maya city like Tikal might get you something slightly different in Teotihuacan, the massive city of the highlands with its pyramids of the sun and moon. This lack of a unified federal cacao reserve is something scholars still work to piece together, looking at archaeological evidence from marketplaces, residue analysis on pottery, and the few surviving codices or painted books. One particularly fascinating aspect is the relationship between tribute and currency. The Aztec Empire, for instance, was built on a system of tribute exacted from conquered peoples. These subject territories were required to send vast quantities of goods to the capital, Tenochtitlan. And guess what was a prime item on the tribute list? Cacao beans, often by the thousands of loads. These beans then flowed into the capital's massive marketplaces, like Tlatelolco, said to be even larger than contemporary European cities like Seville or Rome. So the empire wasn't just minting coins, it was essentially minting value by demanding and redistributing a highly prized natural resource. This influx of beans from the tribute system would have been crucial for maintaining the liquidity of the market. It's a bit like a government printing money, but instead of a printing press, they used an army and a very well-organized tribute collection system. Pay up or else, and make sure those beans are prime quality. None of that dirt-filled nonsense. You lean back against the trunk of the ceiba tree, feeling the rough bark against your shoulder. The initial sensory bombardment of the market has faded into a more manageable, almost hypnotic rhythm. The sun is beginning its slow descent towards the western horizon, though it will be hours before it sets. Some vendors are starting to pack up their less perishable goods, while others, selling food and drink, are preparing for the evening crowd. The value of a cacao bean wasn't just in its scarcity or its divine association, it was also in its portability and divisibility. You could carry a fair amount of purchasing power in a small bag, and individual beans were small enough units for everyday transactions. You couldn't easily cut a jade bead in half to make change, but you could always count out the precise number of beans. This made it a very practical form of money for a society without widespread metallurgy for coinage. It's a clever solution, really, using something organic, something that connects directly back to the earth and the gods, to facilitate the complexities of human exchange. It almost makes you wonder what we've lost by moving to sterile, abstract forms of value. Though, admittedly, trying to buy a new laptop with a bushel of apples might present some logistical challenges for the Apple Store geniuses. Is this a Fuji or a Gala? Because that affects the exchange rate, sir. You ponder the journey of a single cacao bean. It starts as a seed within a pod, growing on a tree in a humid, tropical forest, tended by farmers who understood its delicate needs. It's harvested, the beans extracted, fermented, dried, and then perhaps transported hundreds of miles by canoe or on the backs of porters. It arrives in a bustling marketplace like this one, where it might be exchanged for a piece of pottery, a feather cloak, a meal, or even used to pay a fine or a tax. It might be ground and consumed by a noble, or offered to a god, or simply stored away as a measure of wealth. It's a tiny thing, a cacao bean, yet it carries within it a whole world of economic, social, and religious significance. It's a far cry from just being the raw ingredient for a comforting hot chocolate on a chilly evening, though that's a pretty good destiny for a bean too. The shadows are lengthening now. The air is cooling slightly, carrying the scent of wood smoke as evening cooking fires are lit. The market is still alive, but the energy is shifting, becoming less about commerce and more about community, the day's work winding down. You feel a sense of peace, a connection to this ancient rhythm. You've witnessed a system of value so different from your own, yet so fundamentally human in its purpose: to facilitate exchange, to store wealth, to make life in all its complex, messy glory just a little bit easier to navigate. And all with a humble bean. A bean that was quite literally good enough for the gods, and good enough to build empires upon. You close your eyes for a moment, just soaking it all in. The murmur of voices, the distant sounds, the lingering scent of cacao in the air. All right, so you've had a little taste of the marketplace, a snapshot of daily commerce powered by the humble cacao bean. But let's pull back the curtain a bit further, shall we? Let's drift away from the immediate hustle and bustle and consider the wider world that made this cacaonomy possible. You're still you, still an observer, but now you're perhaps a little more curious, a little more invested in understanding how this all works. You're no longer just a casual browser in the market. You're starting to see the invisible threads connecting that single bean to a vast and intricate web of human endeavor. Imagine for a moment you're leaving the city, venturing out into the countryside where the real magic, or rather the real agriculture, begins. The air changes. The concentrated human smells of the market give way to the scent of damp earth, lush vegetation, and the faintest hint of wood smoke from distant homesteads. You're moving towards the cacao growing regions, the source of all this bean based wealth. These aren't vast monoculture plantations like you might picture for modern chocolate production. Instead, cacao trees are often part of a more diverse agroforestry system. They thrive in the understory, beneath the protective canopy of larger shade trees like the Madre de Cacao or other fruit bearing trees. Think of it as a carefully managed forest garden, a testament to generations of agricultural knowledge. This agroforestry approach is a key historical fact. Cacao was typically cultivated in mixed crop systems, which were ecologically more stable and provided other resources for the farmers. You see families tending to these groves. It's not easy work. The trees are delicate, susceptible to pests and diseases. Farmers would have to be vigilant, constantly monitoring their precious crop. They'd be looking for signs of trouble: wilted leaves, discolored pods. And harvesting isn't a simple pluck and go operation. The large, football shaped cacao pods grow directly from the trunk and main branches of the tree. They're harvested carefully using long poles with knives attached or by climbing the trees. Then comes the messy part: breaking open the tough pods to reveal the white, pulpy mucilage surrounding the beans, typically 30 to 50 beans per pod. This pulp, by the way, is actually quite sweet and tangy. It was sometimes fermented into a mildly alcoholic beverage, a little bonus for the hardworking farmer. So, not only are they growing money, they're growing the occasional happy hour ingredient. Talk about a versatile crop. Honey, I'm off to cultivate our financial future and maybe a light buzz for the weekend. Once extracted, the beans and their surrounding pulp undergo a crucial fermentation process. This isn't just leaving them out in the sun to rot. It's a controlled process, often done in piles or wooden boxes, covered with banana leaves. The heat generated by the natural yeast and bacteria transforms the beans, developing the precursors of that rich chocolate flavor we know and love, and also reducing their bitterness. This can take several days, and the beans need to be turned regularly. After fermentation, they're carefully dried, usually on mats in the sun. Only then are they ready for storage, for trade, or for that journey to the distant marketplace you witnessed earlier. It's a labor-intensive process, from seedling to dried bean, requiring skill, patience, and a good bit of luck with the weather. Now here's a slightly quirky detail: the social standing of a cacao farmer. You might think that growing money would make you automatically wealthy and respected. And while successful cacao cultivators were certainly better off than those who had no land or less valuable crops, they weren't necessarily at the very top of the social pyramid. The real wealth often accrued to the merchants who controlled the long-distance trade routes and the nobles who received cacao as tribute or managed large estates. The farmers were the primary producers, essential to the system, but like many primary producers throughout history, they didn't always reap the lion's share of the profits. It's the age-old story of farmer versus middleman, played out with beans instead of banknotes. Let's consider the journey these beans undertake. Mesoamerica was a land of diverse and often challenging geography. Dense jungles, high mountain ranges, and vast distances between major population centers. As mentioned, they didn't have wheeled vehicles for transport, nor large draft animals like horses or oxen. So, how did these precious beans, often in bulk, travel from the lowland growing regions to highland cities like Tenochtitlan or the Maya centers in the Payten? The answer is on the backs of human porters, known as tlamims in the Nahuatl language of the Aztecs. These were incredibly strong and resilient individuals, carrying heavy loads, sometimes up to 50 pounds or more, supported by a tumpline, a strap across the forehead. They would travel in caravans, often along well-established trade routes, for days or even weeks. Imagine the physical toll, the endurance required. These weren't just delivery guys, they were the lifeblood of the Mesoamerican economy, the unsung heroes who literally carried wealth across the land. Historians still debate the exact nature and organization of these long distance trade networks. Were they primarily state controlled, or dominated by independent merchant guilds, or a mix of both? For the Aztecs, there was a famous and powerful class of long distance merchants known as the Pochteca. These weren't just traders, they were also spies, diplomats, and information gatherers for the empire. They ventured into distant, sometimes hostile territories, not only to trade valuable goods like cacao, jade, and exotic feathers, but also to assess the political landscape and identify potential areas for Aztec expansion. The Pochteca had their own gods, their own rituals, and a distinct social standing, sometimes even rivaling the traditional nobility in wealth and influence. Their caravans were often armed, as the goods they carried were immensely valuable and attractive to bandits or rival groups. So, that bag of cacao beans you saw in the market, it might have had a very adventurous, even dangerous journey, possibly involving a Pochteca merchant who was part James Bond, part Marco Polo, and part CEO of a major import-export business. You picture yourself now, not in the market, but perhaps on one of these trade routes. You're part of a caravan. The path is narrow, winding through dense forest. The air is thick with humidity, the sounds of unseen insects, a constant chorus. You can hear the rhythmic breathing of the porters, the shuffle of their sandals on the trail. The weight on your own, imaginary back feels immense. Every step is an effort. At night, the caravan makes camp, fires are lit, and guards are posted. There's a sense of camaraderie, but also of constant vigilance. The value of your cargo, those sacks of dried cacao beans, is never far from your mind. It's a stark reminder that wealth, in any form, often comes with risk and requires considerable effort to acquire and protect. It makes complaining about a lost Amazon package seem a bit trivial, doesn't it? Oh no, my artisanal, single, origin, ethically sourced package of artisanal chocolate is delayed by a day. The horror. These guys were dealing with armed guards and the potential for actual highway robbery of their bean fortune. Let's delve into the quantities. We're not talking about a few beans here and there for personal use. Tribute lists from the Aztec Empire, recorded in documents like the Codex Mendoza, detail astonishing amounts of cacao being demanded from conquered provinces. We're talking about cargas, or loads, where one carga might contain 24,000 beans. Some provinces were required to pay hundreds, even thousands of these cargas annually. This gives you a sense of the scale. The Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan, was a massive consumer and redistributor of cacao. This steady influx of beans was essential for the functioning of its huge marketplaces and for the state to pay its officials, warriors, and fund public works. A mainstream historical fact is that the Aztec tribute system was a primary driver for the large-scale movement and concentration of cacao, effectively underpinning its role as a widespread currency within their sphere of influence. But what about quality control on such a massive scale? We talked about counterfeit beans in the marketplace. Imagine trying to verify the quality of 20 cargas of cacao. It's likely there were specialized officials or experienced merchants whose job it was to inspect these tribute payments. They'd be looking for undersized beans, signs of mold, or those infamous clay-filled counterfeits. The penalties for trying to shortchange the empire were probably quite severe. You wouldn't want to be the provincial governor whose tribute shipment was found to be 10% dirt. That's a career-ending, possibly life-ending mistake. One of the slightly more unusual uses or associations of cacao, beyond just currency or a beverage for the elite, was its connection to blood and sacrifice in some Mesoamerican cultures. The reddish-brown drink made from cacao was sometimes likened to blood in ritual contexts. While this might sound a bit grim, it's important to understand it within their cosmological framework, where sacrifice of various kinds, not always human, was seen as necessary to nourish the gods and maintain the balance of the universe. Cacao, as a food of the gods, fit naturally into this symbolic system. Sometimes the drink was even colored with annatto to make it look even more like blood for certain ceremonies. This doesn't mean every cup of zacatl was a somber, sacrificial affair. It was also enjoyed in feasts and celebrations, but it adds another layer to the bean's profound significance. It's like finding out your morning coffee also has deep theological implications and is occasionally used in high stakes divine negotiations. I'll trade you this latte for a good harvest deal. The social impact of a currency like cacao is also worth pondering. Did it lead to greater social mobility? Or did it reinforce existing hierarchies? Historians have different views on this, leading to another area of academic discussion. On one hand, having a divisible and portable form of currency could, in theory, allow enterprising individuals to accumulate wealth through trade or skilled craft production, potentially improving their social standing. If you were a skilled featherworker or a potter, and your goods were in demand, you could earn cacao and perhaps buy land or luxury items that were previously out of reach. On the other hand, the control of cacao production in the fertile lowland regions and the dominance of long-distance trade by powerful merchant groups like the Pochteca or the nobility meant that the existing elites were often in the best position to accumulate and control this form of wealth. So, while cacao currency might have greased the wheels of commerce for many, the superhighways of wealth were likely still dominated by those already in power. It's a familiar pattern. New technologies or economic systems often promise to level the playing field, but old power structures can be remarkably adept at adapting and maintaining their advantage. You shift your perspective again. Imagine you are a noble in a Maya city-state, say Yaxchilan or Palenque, during the Classic period, roughly 250 to 900 AD, well before the Aztecs rose to prominence. Cacao is already highly valued. You have access to it perhaps from your own lands or through tribute from smaller dependent villages. You use it to acquire exotic goods brought by traders: jade from the Motagua Valley, obsidian from the volcanic highlands, brightly colored quetzal feathers from the cloud forests. You also use it in feasting, serving the bitter, frothy xocolotl to your guests in beautifully painted ceramic vessels. These vessels themselves are status symbols, often depicting scenes of courtly life, mythology, or even the cacao god himself, a deity often shown with a cacao pod growing from his head or body. These painted ceramics provide invaluable clues for archaeologists. Sometimes chemical analysis of the residues inside these ancient pots confirms they once held cacao beverages. The intricate scenes painted on them offer glimpses into how cacao was used, by whom, and in what context. It's like finding an ancient Instagram feed where instead of avocado toast, it's all about the high-status xocolotl consumption. Just enjoying my frothy god drink from my new jaguar effigy pot. Shadius blessed Sasamayan royalty, Sakumas cacao life. Consider the variations in the drink itself. It wasn't a standardized recipe. Different regions, different social classes, and different occasions called for different preparations. Some liked it thick, some thin. Some added honey or agave syrup for sweetness, though this was less common for the elite men who often seemed to prefer it bitter. Others added chili powder for a spicy kick, or achiota annatto for color and a subtle peppery flavor, or MakeADifference, piper amalgo, a relative of black pepper, or Tlilixauquitl, vanilla pods, for fragrance and flavor. The preparation was an art form. The frothing, as mentioned, was particularly important, achieved by pouring the liquid back and forth between two vessels from a height, or by using a special wooden frothing stick, a precursor to the moldonillo still used in Mexico today. A good host was expected to serve a well-frothed beverage. Flat sacolel? Social faux pas. Now, for a detail that borders on the bizarre but is historically attested, sometimes in certain Maya rituals cacao was mixed with human blood. particularly blood drawn in auto-sacrifice by nobles or priests, through tongue or earlobe piercing, for example. This potent mixture was then consumed or offered to deities. This ties back to the cacao blood symbolism and the idea of nourishing the gods with precious substances. It's a stark reminder that while we're talking about chocolate, its ancient context was far removed from our casual indulgence. This wasn't about satisfying a sweet tooth, it was about engaging with the sacred, with power, and with the very fabric of their cosmos. It's definitely a PG-13 detail, but crucial for understanding the depth of cacao's significance. You wouldn't find that particular blend at your local Starbucks, one hopes. Yes, I'll have a grande xocolade. That'll hold the sheer economic organization required to manage cacao as currency is impressive. Think about accounting. How did they keep track of bean-based transactions, debts, and tributes, especially without a simple alphabetic writing system for everyday bookkeeping in many areas? The Maya had a sophisticated hieroglyphic system, but it was primarily used for monumental inscriptions and codices dealing with dynastic history, astronomy, and ritual, not typically for day-to-day accounting. The Aztecs used pictorial records. It's likely that for many transactions, memory knotted cords, like the quipu in the Andes, though their use in Mesoamerica is less clear for this purpose, or simple tally marks on perishable materials were used. There were also standardized units beyond the single bean, like the zontele, 400 beans, and the sicapili, 8,000 beans, used by the Aztecs, which would have made counting large quantities more manageable. So, if a noble owed the state a tribute of, say, 20 zikapilas of cacao, that was a clearly understood quantity. It demonstrates a level of mathematical and organizational sophistication that is often underestimated. The debate among scholars about the true nature of Mesoamerican economies, whether they can be understood through modern capitalist frameworks or if they operated on entirely different principles like gift economies or systems primarily driven by tribute and redistribution rather than free markets, is very much alive. Applying modern economic theory wholesale to ancient societies can be misleading. While cacao certainly functioned as a medium of exchange, a unit of account, and a store of value, the classic definitions of money, its use was also deeply embedded in social relationships, political power, and religious beliefs. It wasn't just an abstract tool, it was imbued with meaning. Could you haggle over the price of a sacrificial offering in cacao beans? Probably, but the transaction was about more than just economic gain. You imagine the sound of those beans, the dry rustle as they're poured from a sack, the clinking, if you can call it that, as they're counted out. It would have been a familiar sound in any Mesoamerican marketplace or household of any standing. It's the sound of commerce, yes, but also the sound of sustenance, of social obligation, of divine connection. It's a sound that whispers of a world both alien and surprisingly familiar in its fundamental human concerns. How to get what you need, how to measure value, how to interact with your neighbors in the wider world. Think about the end of a market day. The sun is setting, casting long shadows. The vendors are packing up. Some are counting their day's earnings, like a pouch full of cacao beans. What does that represent for them? It's not just an abstract number in a bank account. It's food for their family for the next few days, perhaps a new tool they need, or a contribution towards a community feast or religious ceremony. Each bean is tangible. You can hold it, feel its smoothness, smell its faint, earthy aroma. There's an immediacy to this form of wealth that is lost with digital transactions. You can't exactly savor the aroma of your PayPal balance, can you? Or lovingly polish your Bitcoin. Well, maybe some people do. I don't judge. The reach of this cacao currency was vast. Archaeologists have found evidence of cacao far from its growing regions, indicating extensive trade networks that spanned hundreds, if not thousands of miles, from the tropical lowlands of Chiapas and Guatemala up into the arid regions of northern Mexico and perhaps even into parts of what is now the American Southwest. This wasn't just a local phenomenon. It was an economic system that connected diverse peoples and cultures across a huge geographical area, all centered on this one remarkable bean. It facilitated not just the exchange of goods, but also the exchange of ideas, technologies, and cultural practices. Cacao was a traveler, a connector, a silent witness to the ebb and flow of empires and the daily lives of millions. And as you drift further, you realize that this bean, this currency, is more than just an economic tool. It's a character in a grand historical drama, a story that's still being pieced together, one bean, one potsherd, one hieroglyph at a time. So you've journeyed from the bustling marketplace, through the shaded cacao groves and along the arduous trade routes. You've seen the bean as a humble unit of exchange and as a sacred offering. Now let's bring our focus to the zenith of this cacao-centric world, particularly under the sway of the Aztec or Mexica civilization, just before everything changed. You're still drifting, still observing, perhaps from a vantage point overlooking the magnificent island city of Tenochtitlan, its pyramids and palaces seeming to float on the waters of Lake Texcoco. The air here, too, carries the scent of cacao, not just from the markets, but from the storerooms of the elite and the temples of the gods. Tenochtitlan was the heart of a vast tribute empire, and as we've touched upon, cacao beans were a significant part of this incoming wealth. A mainstream historical fact is that the Aztec state systematically organized the collection and redistribution of cacao, using it to pay state functionaries, warriors, and to finance imperial projects. Imagine the imperial treasury not filled with gold bullion in the way a European king might have, but with vast storehouses piled high with precious cacao beans, meticulously accounted for. There would have been scribes with their painted codices, tracking every incoming shipment, every outgoing payment. All right, Moctezuma, sir. Payroll for the Jaguar Knights is due. That'll be, let's see, 3 Jicapillis and a Zontli of prime Tabasco beans. And don't forget the allotment for the temple renovation. They're requesting an extra carga for the dedication ceremony. Apparently the gods have developed a taste for the frothy stuff. Life in Tenochtitlan for the average person, if such a concept even applies, would still involve cacao, though perhaps not in the lavish quantities enjoyed by the nobility. You might be a craftsman, a weaver, or a farmer, bringing your goods to the great market of Tlatelolco, a city within a city teeming with tens of thousands of people. Here, cacao was the oil in the economic engine. A rabbit might cost you 30 beans, a turkey hen 100 beans, or a turkey cock 200 beans. A canoe full of fresh water essential in the brackish lake environment could be 2 to 3 beans. Even services had their price. A consultation with a tissel or physician might cost you a certain number of beans depending on the ailment and the treatment. It's fascinating how granular the pricing could be. You could, quite literally, count out your payment for a single avocado or a handful of chilies. Now, for a slightly unusual detail that highlights the ubiquity of cacao in Aztec society, it was even used in legal judgments. Fines for certain offenses could be levied in cacao beans. So, if you got into a bit of a scuffle in the marketplace, or were found guilty of some minor transgression, you might find yourself having to pay up in chocolate money. It adds a whole new meaning to paying your dues to society. Imagine a courtroom drama. The defendant is found guilty of public nuisance and is hereby fined 50 cacao beans. Next case. It makes you wonder if they had bean-based bail bondsmen. The sheer volume of cacao flowing into Tenochtitlan from the tribute-paying provinces, especially from regions like Soconusco, on the Pacific coast of Chiapas, known for its high-quality beans, was staggering. This constant influx was crucial. However, this system wasn't without its challenges. Maintaining control over distant, cacao-rich provinces required a strong military and an efficient administrative apparatus. Rebellions in these tributary regions were not uncommon, often sparked by the heavy demands for tribute, including cacao. When a province rebelled, the Aztec response was typically swift and brutal, a reminder that this bean-based economy was ultimately underwritten by military power. The flow of beans had to be maintained, by persuasion if possible, by force if necessary. One of the enduring academic debates revolves around the true monetary nature of cacao beans, especially when compared to, say, European coinage of the same period. Some scholars emphasize that while cacao served many functions of money, its inherent nature as a consumable commodity and its strong ritualistic associations set it apart. Was it a general purpose money like coins, used for almost any transaction and by almost anyone? Or was its use more restricted in certain spheres, with barter or other forms of exchange still prevalent for many goods or among certain social classes? Evidence suggests it was remarkably widespread, but perhaps not as universally abstract as later forms of currency. For instance, while you could buy a wide array of goods with cacao, very large transactions like the purchase of land by nobles might also involve other high-value items like cotton textiles or jade. The system was likely a complex mix with cacao as a dominant, but not exclusive medium of exchange. It's a bit like today. We use cash, credit cards, digital payments, sometimes even barter for services. Ancient economies were probably just as multifaceted. You picture yourself now as a European, one of the very first to arrive in this new world in the early 16th century. Perhaps you're with Cortez's expedition, marching towards the Aztec capital. Everything is alien. The landscape, the people, the architecture. And then you encounter this strange economic system. You see people using these brown beans to buy and sell goods. Initially, you might be baffled. Where's the gold? Where's the silver? That's what European conquerors were primarily interested in. But slowly you begin to realize the local importance of cacao. Early Spanish chroniclers like Bernal Diaz del Castillo, who accompanied Cortez, noted with fascination the use of cacao beans as currency, and the vast storerooms of Moctezuma filled with them. They even started using cacao themselves for small transactions in the early colonial period because of the lack of small denomination coins. It must have been quite an adjustment. Captain, I'd like to buy this rather nice obsidian dagger, but all I have are these heavy gold doubloons. Do you have change in, beans? The arrival of the Spanish, of course, marked the beginning of a profound and often tragic transformation for Mesoamerican societies and their economies. The conquest brought disease, warfare, and the imposition of a new colonial order. The traditional tribute systems were co-opted and redirected towards the Spanish crown and encomenderos. Spaniards granted rights to indigenous labor and tribute. Gold and silver quickly became the primary focus of the colonial economy, destined for export to Europe. Yet cacao didn't just disappear overnight. For a time, it continued to be used as local currency, and the Spanish themselves developed a taste for the chocolatl beverage, though they often modified it to their own preferences, adding sugar, cinnamon, and other European spices. This marks a significant turning point. The European adaptation and eventual global spread of chocolate, albeit in a sweetened form, began here. So, that fancy Swiss chocolate bar you might enjoy has a direct lineage back to these Mesoamerican beans of exchange. A curious sidelight from this early colonial period is the Spanish concern over the purity of cacao used for tribute and trade. Just as the Aztecs had dealt with counterfeit beans, the Spanish authorities also had to contend with indigenous people trying to pass off inferior or even fake beans to meet their tribute obligations. There are colonial documents detailing regulations and inspections aimed at ensuring the quality of cacao. Some things, it seems, never change. The taxman always wants his due in full, and people will always try to find clever ways to pay a little less. Padre, these beans feel a bit light. And is that a whiff of mud I detect? The king's share must be pure. The long-term impact of the European conquest on the cacao economy was complex. While the large-scale imperial systems of the Aztecs were dismantled, cacao cultivation continued, now often on plantations controlled by Spanish landowners using indigenous labor. The beans were still valuable, not just for local consumption and trade, but increasingly as an export commodity to Europe, where chocolate drinking was becoming a fashionable, albeit expensive, habit among the aristocracy. This shift from a primarily internal Mesoamerican currency and elite beverage to a global commodity had profound consequences for the indigenous populations who cultivated it, often under harsh conditions. The food of the gods began a new chapter, one increasingly tied to global markets and colonial exploitation. Historians still discuss the speed and completeness of the transition away from cacao as a widespread local currency. In some more remote areas or for smaller everyday transactions, it likely persisted for quite some time, even as silver coinage became more common. The integration of indigenous economies into the Spanish colonial system was a gradual and uneven process. It wasn't like one day everyone just stopped using beans and switched to pesos. Economic habits can be deeply ingrained. There was likely a period of overlap where both systems coexisted and people navigated between them. Imagine an old woman in a village market, still preferring to count out her payment in familiar cacao beans while the Spanish merchant in Mexico City is dealing in silver ingots. The transition would have been lived differently by different people in different places. As you watch this historical tapestry unfold, you see the resilience of cacao itself. Even as its role as a formal currency waned with the influx of Spanish silver, its cultural and culinary importance endured, both within Mesoamerica and increasingly globally. The drink, transformed by sugar and spices, captivated European palates. Plantations spread to other tropical regions of the world, but the origin, the heart of it all, lies here, in these ancient lands, with these people who first recognized the divine and economic potential of a humble bean. It makes you think about what we value today and how those values might seem just as strange or fascinating to someone looking back from the distant future. Will they marvel at our obsession with little plastic cards or the digital bits and bytes that represent our wealth? They exchange these crypto coins for actual goods. How quaint. Do they at least taste good? The sun is setting now, not just on your day in the ancient marketplace or your journey through the cacao groves, but metaphorically on this era of Mesoamerican autonomy. The world of the cacao bean currency is fading into history, becoming a story whispered by the wind through the ruins of great cities. Yet, its legacy is all around us in every bar of chocolate, every steaming cup of cocoa. It's a legacy of innovation, of complex societies, of a deep connection to the natural world, and of a value system that, for a time, quite literally grew on trees. You see the last few traders in the twilight, carefully packing away the remaining beans, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of a distant fire. The sounds of the city are quieting. The stars are beginning to appear in the darkening sky, the same stars that once guided those Pashteca merchants on their long and perilous journeys. There's a sense of completion, of a cycle ending, but also of something enduring, something passed on. And as the last vestiges of this bean-based world recede into the quiet folds of history, you feel a sense of calm, of appreciation for this glimpse into a time so different, yet so connected to our own story of human ingenuity and our eternal quest for value, for sustenance, and perhaps for a little bit of divine flavor in our lives. The story of cacao as currency is a reminder that money, in any form, is ultimately a human invention, a shared agreement, a story we tell ourselves about what matters. And for a significant part of human history in a vibrant corner of the world, that story was told with a small, brown, and utterly remarkable bean. Now, as the echoes of the ancient marketplace fade, and the rustle of cacao leaves in the night breeze softens to a whisper, let your own mind begin to quiet. The journey is complete. The weight of the day, any lingering thoughts of your own currency, your own transactions, can begin to feel distant, less important. Allow yourself to float, just as you've been drifting through these historical scenes. The air around you is still, peaceful. Imagine the soft, earthy scent of those ancient cacao groves, not as a place of toil, but as a sanctuary of deep, natural calm. The shade of the great canopy trees filters out the noise, filters out the concerns. Each breath you take is a little slower now, a little deeper. Feel your shoulders relax, your jaw soften. There are no demands on you here, no ledgers to balance, no tribute to pay, only the gentle pull of approaching slumber. The vibrant colors of the market, the deep greens of the jungle, the rich browns of the cacao beans themselves, all begin to merge and soften like watercolors in a gentle rain. The voices of the past are silent now, replaced by the quiet rhythm of your own breathing. Let any remaining tension dissolve, like sugar melting into a warm, comforting drink. You are safe, you are comfortable, and you are ready for rest. The stories have been told, the beans have been counted, and the day, both ancient and present, is drawing to a peaceful close. Allow yourself to sink deeper into that comfort, into that quiet. Hey everyone, tonight we're taking a rather chilly detour back in time to Imperial China to uncover the surprisingly ancient and somewhat strange history of ice cream, or at least its very distant, very cool ancestors. Imagine this. You're not currently debating whether to get a single or double scoop of salted caramel pistachio swirl from that trendy new gelateria. Instead, you're in a lavish imperial garden, centuries ago, and a servant is approaching with a delicate porcelain bowl. Inside isn't a creamy, churned delight as you know it, but something far more enigmatic, a frozen concoction that's the result of immense labor and ingenuity. Honestly, given the effort involved in getting and storing ice back then, you probably wouldn't last a day if your main craving was a brain freeze. You'd have to be an emperor, or at least seriously well connected to even get a sniff of these frosty treats. It was less I scream, you scream, and more only the Son of Heaven screams for ice cream. Very, very quietly. So, before you get too comfortable and start dreaming of imperial ice palaces, which, let's be honest, probably had terrible heating bills, please do take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. No pressure, just good vibes and sleepy time stories. And hey, while you're at it, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's always a treat to see how far these little historical jaunts travel. Now let's dim the lights, turn on your fan for that gentle white noise, and let's begin tonight's journey together. You find yourself not in a bustling modern city, but stepping into the refined and often rarefied air of imperial China. The exact dynasty isn't crucial for this first moment, as the love for ice delicacies has ancient roots here, but let's imagine perhaps the Tang dynasty, around the 7th to 10th centuries AD, a golden age of art, culture, and surprisingly, frozen refreshments. You're not in a common market square this time. Oh no, this isn't something for the masses, not yet anyway. You are perhaps a privileged observer, maybe a minor official or a visiting dignitary with very good connections, granted access to the imperial parks or the cool inner courtyards of a nobleman's estate during a sweltering summer. The heat is a palpable presence, a heavy blanket over the city. Cicadas thrum their relentless song from the willow trees. The flagstones beneath your slippered feet radiate warmth. Servants fan the air languidly, stirring small breezes that offer only momentary relief. It's the kind of heat that makes you long for something, anything, cool. And then you see it. A procession of servants, moving with practiced grace, carrying insulated boxes or delicate lidded containers. They approach the host, perhaps a portly magistrate or a slender silk-clad princess, and present their precious cargo. What's inside isn't ice cream as we know it. No cones, no sprinkles, no arguments over the best flavor. Instead, it's more likely a carefully prepared dish of iced fruit, or perhaps a concoction of milk, maybe from a cow, a goat, or even a water buffalo, mixed with rice, flavorings like camphor or floral essences, and then, crucially, frozen or chilled to a delightful coolness. This brings us to a mainstream historical fact. The ancient Chinese were pioneers in methods of storing and using ice for culinary purposes long before it became common in the West. As far back as the Zhou dynasty, circa 1046 to 256 BC, There are records of icemen, or ice officials, whose job it was to harvest ice from frozen rivers and ponds in winter, and store it in specially constructed ice pits or cellars for use in the warmer months. These ice cellars were often deep underground, insulated with straw, reeds, and earth, marvels of ancient engineering designed to preserve winter's chill through the blazing summer. Imagine the logistics: cutting massive blocks of ice, hauling them, often for considerable distances, and then carefully packing them away, hoping enough would survive the journey and the long wait. It was a high-stakes game of beat the thaw. You watch as a serving girl, her movements precise, ladles a small portion of a chilled, milky mixture into a fine porcelain bowl. It's not quite solid, perhaps more like a slush or a very thick, cold custard. The aroma is subtle, maybe a hint of honey for sweetness, or the exotic fragrance of jasmine or osmanthus blossoms that were popular for flavoring. The recipient takes a small, deliberate spoonful. A look of blissful relief crosses their face. In this oppressive heat, such a treat isn't just a luxury, it's a statement of power and wealth. To command ice in summer was to command nature itself, or at least to have the resources to trick it very effectively. You can almost hear the internal monologue. Yes, suffer in the heat, mere mortals. I, on the other hand, have ice. Bow down to my superior cooling methods. One of the more curious details of these early frozen treats is the sheer variety of ingredients they experimented with. While milk-based concoctions were known, particularly later on, many of the earliest chilled dishes were probably simpler. Fruits packed in ice or sweetened beverages cooled down significantly, but they also got creative. There are mentions of mixtures involving rice, flour, various kinds of milk, cow, goat, mare, even buffalo, and flavorings that might seem unusual to our modern ice cream palate. Camphor, a strongly aromatic substance, was sometimes used. While a tiny amount might add a certain freshness, too much would probably taste like you're eating a very fancy frozen mothball. It definitely makes you appreciate the relative safety of vanilla or chocolate. Would you care for another scoop of our signature camphor and yak milk ice? It's an acquired taste, and it keeps the moths away from your silks. The methods of actually freezing the mixtures, beyond just chilling them with stored ice, were also developing. They didn't have freezers or ice cream makers with electric motors, obviously, but they understood the principle of endothermic reactions. A key technique, which became more refined over time, involved placing a container of the liquid mixture into a larger outer vessel filled with a mixture of ice and salt, or saltpeter. The salt lowers the freezing point of the ice, causing it to melt, but in doing so, it draws heat from the inner container, chilling and eventually freezing its contents. This is a basic principle of refrigeration that was understood and utilized long before Mr. Birdseye came along. So while you might not see a perfectly smooth, churned sorbet, you definitely get something refreshingly semi-frozen. Historians still debate the exact origins and evolution of these frozen desserts in China, and how much the early forms truly resembled what we'd call ice cream today. Were the earliest ice dishes just fruit and honey cooled with ice, or did they quickly move to more complex milk-based recipes? Records from ancient texts like the Shijing Book of Odes mention the harvesting and storage of ice for religious ceremonies and for cooling food for the aristocracy, dating back perhaps as early as 1100 BC. Later texts from the Tang and Song dynasties, 618 to 907 AD and 960 to 1279 AD respectively, provide more specific, though sometimes tantalizingly vague, descriptions of chilled or frozen milk and rice dishes, often flavored with various aromatics. The lines can be blurry between a chilled drink, a sorbet-like ice, and a creamy frozen dessert. It's likely there was a spectrum of these treats evolving over centuries. Some scholars suggest that the techniques for making truly frozen, rather than just chilled milk-based desserts, were a later development, perhaps refined during the Tang or Song periods, while others argue for even earlier, simpler forms. You drift through this imagined imperial garden, the privileged observer. You see the importance of exclusivity. This isn't something you could just buy from a street vendor. Access to ice, and therefore to these frozen delicacies, was strictly controlled. The ice sellers were often imperial monopolies or belonged to wealthy, powerful families. The icemen who managed them held positions of considerable importance. Think about it. Controlling the ice supply in a hot climate was like controlling a vital resource, a bit like being the only person with air conditioning in a heat wave. You'd be very popular and very powerful. This exclusivity meant that offering an iced treat to a guest was a significant display of status and hospitality. It wasn't just about refreshment, it was about demonstrating your ability to command resources, to defy the seasons. You notice the meticulousness of it all. The porcelain bowls are paper thin, perhaps celadon green or fine white ware, works of art in themselves. The spoons might be silver or carved from jade. Even the presentation of the ice itself, if it's being used to chill fruits, would be artful. This isn't just about shoveling down some frozen sugar, it's a ritual, a refined sensory experience. The modern equivalent might be a Michelin-starred restaurant's deconstructed dessert, where every element is placed with tweezers, except here, the main marvel is the cold itself. Now let's consider the journey of the ice itself. Imagine it's midwinter in northern China. The rivers are frozen solid. Teams of laborers bundled against the biting cold are out on the ice, sawing and hacking away. They cut enormous blocks, weighing hundreds of pounds, sometimes even tons. These blocks are then dragged by men, or perhaps on sledges, to the entrances of the ice pits. This was dangerous, grueling work. Men could slip, fall into the frigid water, or be crushed by shifting ice. It makes complaining about a bit of frost on your car windshield seem rather pathetic. These guys were literally wrestling with winter to provide a summer luxury. All right, lads, one more giant ice cube for the Emperor's daiquiri, and try not to lose any fingers to frostbite this time. It spoils his appetite. Once inside the ice pit, the blocks were carefully stacked, insulated with layers of straw, sawdust, or reeds to minimize melting. The goal was to preserve as much of this winter treasure as possible through the spring and into the scorching summer months. Despite their best efforts, a significant portion of the ice would inevitably melt, so the amount harvested had to be far greater than the amount eventually used. It was an enterprise of grand scale and considerable uncertainty. A mild winter might mean a poor ice harvest, leading to an ice crisis for the elite the following summer. Imagine the imperial court in a panic. The ice reserves are down 30%. We may have to resort to lukewarm fruit juice. The horror. A mainstream historical fact is that during the Tang Dynasty, Emperor Shang even bestowed gifts of ice upon his top officials during the hottest days of summer, a practice known as fuping, or dog days ice. This was a mark of great imperial favor. It wasn't just a cool treat, it was a symbol of the emperor's benevolence and his control over the resources of the empire. To receive a portion of this precious, officially sanctioned ice was a big deal, something to boast about. It's like getting a very exclusive, very cold bonus from the big boss. And here's a slightly more unusual detail. Some of these ice houses weren't just for storing ice. Because they were deep, cool, and dark, they were sometimes also used for storing other perishable goods like certain fruits or even meats, extending their availability. So your imperial ice might have a faint, lingering aroma of last season's preserved lychees, or, if you were unlucky, a hint of something a bit more savory. Is that a note of smoked duck in my iced plum puree, Jeeves? The ice house is a shared space, Your Majesty. One must be adaptable. And the development of these ice treats wasn't just happening in a vacuum. Imperial China, especially during periods like the Tang and Song dynasties, was a hub of culinary innovation. There was a sophisticated food culture with an emphasis on diverse ingredients, complex flavors, and artful presentation. Exotic ingredients flowed into China via the Silk Road and maritime trade routes. Chefs and cooks in noble and imperial households were constantly experimenting. So it's natural that they would also turn their creative energies towards chilled and frozen concoctions, especially given the availability of stored ice for the elite. They weren't just trying to make things cold, they were trying to make cold things delicious and interesting. The debate among food historians sometimes touches on the precise definition of ice cream and when these Chinese creations truly qualify. If ice cream by definition requires dairy and a churning process to achieve a smooth texture, then many of the earliest Chinese iced dishes might be better classified as sorbets, granitas, or simply chilled desserts. However, there are records, particularly from the Tang dynasty onwards, that describe preparations involving milk, often heated with flour or rice to thicken it a bit like a custard base, that was then cooled or frozen. King Tang of Shang, this is going much further back, to the Shang dynasty, 1600s to 1046 BC, so this might be more legendary or a very early precursor, is said to have had a method for creating a dish from buffalo milk, flour, and camphor frozen with ice. While the details are sparse and debated, it points to a long tradition of experimenting with frozen milk-based products. So, whether you call it ice cream or imperial frozen delight, the core idea of a special, cooling, and often dairy-based treat was definitely present. You imagine the kitchens of an imperial palace. It's a hive of activity. Dozens of cooks, assistants, and servants are preparing for a grand banquet. In one cooler section, perhaps near the entrance to the ice stores, specialized cooks are working with the precious ice. They're carefully shaving it, crushing it, or using it to chill mixtures in those double pot contraptions. There's an air of focused concentration. A mistake could be costly, wasting precious ice or failing to achieve the perfect consistency for the emperor's dessert. The pressure would be immense. This isn't just cooking, it's high-stakes cold culinary art. One wrong move and you might find yourself on the wrong end of an imperial decree, and those rarely involved a nice severance package. Chef Li, the son of heaven, found an ice crystal that was insufficiently symmetrical. Contemplate your future career options outside the Forbidden City. The ingredients used for flavoring would have been of the highest quality. Fresh lychees, ripe peaches, plums, apricots, all meticulously peeled and prepared. Honey, often the primary sweetener, would be sourced from the best apiaries. Expensive spices and aromatics, some imported, would be used sparingly but effectively. And the milk. It wouldn't be the homogenized, pasteurized stuff we get in cartons. It would be fresh, perhaps with a higher fat content, lending a richer, creamier, or at least thicker quality to the chilled mixtures even without vigorous churning. As you continue your mental stroll through these ancient, chilled corridors of power, you realize that this early form of ice cream was about so much more than just a way to cool down. It was a symbol of status, a testament to human ingenuity in the face of challenging environmental conditions, a canvas for culinary artistry, and a jealously guarded privilege of the elite. It's a long way from a kid chasing an ice cream truck down the street, but the fundamental human desire for a delightful frozen treat on a hot day, that, it seems, is truly timeless. And the Chinese imperial courts, with their ice pits and their camphor-laced frozen custards, were definitely onto something. Thousands of years ago, they just kept it a very, very cool secret for a very long time. All right, so you've witnessed the early exclusive world of imperial ice, the domain of emperors and the highest nobility, where a frozen treat was less about a sugar rush and more about a power flex. Now, let's allow the centuries to drift by like snowflakes melting in slow motion. You're moving forward in time, perhaps into the Song dynasty, 960 to 1279 AD, a period renowned for its refined culture, bustling cities, and significant advancements in science and technology, including, as you might guess, the art of frozen desserts. The air still hums with the energy of imperial China, but things are subtly shifting. You find yourself now not just within the secluded imperial gardens, but perhaps in one of the vibrant, sprawling capital cities of the Song dynasty, like Bianjing, modern-day Kaifeng, or later Linnan, modern-day Hangzhou. These were some of the largest and most sophisticated cities in the world at the time, teeming with merchants, scholars, artisans, and entertainers. And while the most elaborate frozen concoctions were still likely reserved for the elite, hints of these chilly delights were beginning to trickle down, albeit in simpler forms, to a slightly wider, though still affluent, urban audience. Picture the lively tea houses and entertainment districts, the famous pleasure grounds, or wazi, where all sorts of spectacles and delicacies could be found. During the Song Dynasty, a mainstream historical fact is the increased commercialization and variety of foodstuffs available in urban centers, including various types of chilled and frozen treats sold in specialty shops or by street vendors, catering to the prosperous. While true ice cream in the modern, creamy, churned sense was still a ways off for the common person, the availability of iced beverages, sweetened ices, think something akin to a granita or sorbet, and chilled fruits became more widespread, at least for those who could afford them. These wouldn't be using the emperor's private ice stock, of course, but commercial ice houses were becoming more common, though ice was still a relatively expensive commodity. You're wandering through a bustling Song Dynasty marketplace, perhaps on a hot summer's afternoon. The cries of vendors fill the air, selling everything from silks and ceramics to exotic spices and freshly cooked noodles. And then you see it. A stall, perhaps shaded by a simple awning, with clay pots nestled in wooden tubs filled with what looks like melting ice and straw. The vendor, a cheerful fellow with a ready smile, is ladling out portions of a brightly colored, jewel-toned ice into small bowls. It might be flavored with plum juice, apricot, or perhaps the popular swan may, sour plum. It's not creamy, but it's intensely cold and refreshingly tart. This is a step beyond just fruit packed in snow. This is a deliberately crafted frozen refreshment available for purchase. It's the ancient equivalent of a gourmet snow cone stand, and business is brisk. Step right up, get your imperial-ish quality ice, only slightly less exclusive and guaranteed to lower your internal temperature by at least 2 degrees Celsius or your copper coins cheerfully refunded. No refunds, obviously. One of the more curious details from this era is the emergence of what could be described as iced dairy products that were more widely available, even if not fully frozen like ice cream. There are accounts of chilled, sweetened milk drinks, sometimes thickened with rice or other starches, and flavored with things like honey, nuts, or flower petals. These were known by various names, and while they might not have had the texture of a modern milkshake or soft serve, they represented a move towards incorporating dairy into popular cool refreshments. It's the precursor to the idea that milk and cold are a delightful combination, even if they hadn't quite perfected the freezing and churning technology for mass consumption. Imagine a Song Dynasty teenager saving up their allowance for a cup of chilled, honey-sweetened buffalo milk with crushed almonds. It's not a double fudge brownie explosion, but it's a start. The technology for creating cold was also evolving. While natural ice harvested in winter and stored was still the primary source of cold, the understanding of using saltpeter, potassium nitrate, mixed with ice to achieve lower temperatures more rapidly was becoming more refined. This allowed for more efficient chilling and even freezing of smaller batches of mixtures. This didn't mean everyone had a home ice cream maker. Far from it. But for commercial vendors or larger households, it made the production of these delicacies a bit more feasible. They might have specialized insulated containers, perhaps made of wood or ceramic, where an inner pot holding the sweet mixture was surrounded by an ice and saltpeter slurry. Constant stirring or agitation would have been necessary to prevent large ice crystals from forming, and to achieve a smoother consistency, a rudimentary form of churning. This leads to an ongoing discussion among food historians. How smooth were these Song Dynasty frozen treats? Were they able to achieve a texture approaching sorbet or sherbet? Or were they mostly granular, like a modern Italian granita? The surviving texts are often poetic rather than precisely technical in their descriptions. Words like crisp, snow-like, or congealed like jade are used, which could imply different textures. It's likely there was a range depending on the ingredients, the method of freezing, and the skill of the maker. Achieving a consistently smooth, creamy texture without mechanical churners and precise temperature control is incredibly difficult. So, while they were certainly creating delicious and refreshing frozen items, expecting them to match a modern Haagen-Dazs for smoothness might be anachronistic. But then again, who needs perfectly smooth when you've got something exotically flavored and wonderfully cold on a blazing hot day? It's not lumpy, it's artisanally textured, and it costs extra. You picture a wealthy merchant's household in linen. They're hosting a summer banquet. Course after course of exquisite food has been served, and then for dessert, a servant brings out small, elegant bowls containing a shimmering, pale yellow ice. It's flavored with lychee and osmanthus flowers, a delicate and expensive combination. The guests murmur their appreciation. This isn't just a casual treat, it's a carefully orchestrated part of the dining experience, designed to impress and delight. The host beams his investment in ice and skilled cooks paying off in social capital. He might even have his own private ice house, a smaller version of the imperial ones, stocked through considerable effort and expense. The names for these treats were often quite poetic. You might encounter Silver Liquescence Mountain, or Crimson Glow Sherbet, or Jade Frost Paste. It's a far cry from Chunky Monkey or Cookie Dough Catastrophe. These names added to the allure and the sense of refinement. It wasn't just about what it tasted like, but the entire aesthetic experience, the imagery it evoked. This speaks to the highly developed culinary arts of the Song dynasty, where food was often intertwined with poetry, painting, and a sophisticated appreciation for the nuances of flavor, texture, and presentation. Now let's journey forward again into a period of significant change. The Yuan dynasty, 1371 to 1368 AD. This was when China was under Mongol rule, part of the vast empire established by Genghis Khan and his successors. And this is where the story of ice cream, or its precursors, gets particularly interesting, especially in relation to a certain Venetian traveler, Marco Polo. A mainstream historical fact, though one that's also subject to some debate and popular embellishment, is that Marco Polo, during his extensive travels in China in the late 13th century, supposedly encountered various forms of iced desserts, including milk-based ones. The popular narrative often credits him with bringing recipes for these frozen treats, or at least the idea back to Italy, from whence they eventually spread throughout Europe. This is where the story of Chinese ice cream often intersects with the history of European gelato and sherbet. You imagine Marco Polo at the opulent court of Kublai Khan in Xanadu or Dandu, modern-day Beijing. He's a curious observer, meticulously noting the wonders of this advanced civilization. He witnesses lavish banquets, and among the delicacies served, he encounters these remarkable frozen concoctions. Perhaps it's a creamy, sweet mixture made from mare's milk or cow's milk, flavored with fruit juices or honey, and frozen using those advanced ice and saltpeter techniques. It would have been unlike anything commonly known in Europe at the time, where ice treats were far less sophisticated, if known at all beyond cooling drinks with snow. He would have been amazed, not just by the taste, but by the technology and the sheer luxury of it all. Mamma mia, they've frozen the milk, and it doesn't taste like yak. This could be big in Venice. However, the Marco Polo brought ice cream to Europe story is a bit of a historical simplification, and herein lies an academic debate. While Polo's accounts in the Travels of Marco Polo do describe many wonders of China, direct, unambiguous recipes for ice cream are not explicitly detailed in the surviving versions of his text. He mentions seeing iced drinks and possibly fruit ices. Some historians argue that the connection is more circumstantial, or that later storytellers and food writers embellished his role to create a neat, linear narrative for the arrival of ice cream in Europe. Others maintain that he likely did encounter and describe early forms of milk ices, and that this knowledge, even if not in the form of precise recipes, did contribute to the later development of frozen desserts in Italy. It's also important to note that traditions of cooling drinks with snow or ice existed in various parts of the world, including the Middle East, from which some sherbet-like recipes may have reached Europe independently. So, while China certainly had a sophisticated tradition of frozen desserts well before Europe, Marco Polo's exact role as the sole transmitter is a topic of ongoing scholarly discussion. He might have been more of an influencer than an inventor or recipe smuggler. One of the curious details often associated with the Mongol Yuan dynasty's contribution to frozen desserts is their nomadic heritage. The Mongols were traditionally herders, relying heavily on milk, especially mare's milk, which they famously fermented into kumis. It's plausible that their familiarity with milk products, combined with their exposure to Chinese ice-making techniques and the vast resources of the empire they now controlled, led to further innovations in frozen milk-based treats. Some stories even suggest that they had methods of rapidly freezing milk mixtures by placing them in containers and galloping with them on horseback in the frigid winter winds of the steppes, a sort of natural high-speed churning process. While this might be more legend than verifiable fact, it adds a romantic, nomadic flair to the history of ice cream. Imagine a Mongol warrior pausing his conquest to enjoy a freshly churned, wind-blasted kumisikle. Under the Yuan, the imperial court continued the tradition of lavish banquets and luxurious lifestyles, and ice delicacies would have certainly been part of that. The empire's vast reach also meant that ingredients and culinary ideas could travel more freely across Asia. Perhaps new flavorings or techniques from Persia or the Middle East, where sherbets were also known, found their way into Chinese frozen desserts and vice versa. The Silk Road wasn't just for silk and spices, it was also a conduit for culinary cross-pollination. You consider the kitchens of Kublai Khan. They would have been enormous, staffed by cooks from all over the empire, each bringing their own traditions. The demand for ice would have been immense, requiring even larger and more efficient ice storage facilities. Perhaps they even had dedicated ice cream chefs, Mongol or Chinese, experimenting with different types of milk. Cow, goat, mare, buffalo, maybe even camel's milk, and a wider array of sweeteners and flavorings. The scale of the empire meant access to an unprecedented variety of ingredients. Honey, refined sugar, which was becoming more common, fruit syrups, nuts, spices from distant lands, all could have found their way into the imperial ice bowls. It's interesting to think about the texture they were aiming for. Was it the icy, crystalline structure of a sorbet, or were they actively trying to achieve a smoother, creamier consistency for their milk-based ices? The key to creamy ice cream is minimizing the size of the ice crystals. This is typically achieved by incorporating air, overrun, and through rapid freezing and agitation, churning. Without mechanical churners, achieving a very smooth texture would have relied on painstaking manual labor, constant stirring or beating of the mixture as it froze in its ice and saltpeter bath. It's possible that some of the imperial desserts with unlimited labor at their disposal reached a level of smoothness that would be recognizable if perhaps denser than modern ice cream. As you drift through these Yuan dynasty imaginings, the sounds of a vast, multicultural empire surround you. The clatter of horse hooves on paved courtyards, the murmur of different languages, the scent of roasting meats and exotic spices, and somewhere in a cool, dedicated chamber, the rhythmic scraping of a spoon against a freezing bowl, slowly transforming a sweet, milky liquid into a royal delight. The legacy of those early Chinese ice pioneers was not only being preserved, but potentially being expanded upon, influenced by new cultures and new tastes within the Mongol Empire. The strange history of ice cream in China was taking another fascinating frosty turn, and its ripples were perhaps beginning to spread further across the globe than ever before, even if the exact path is still a little frosted over by the mists of time.
All right. You've journeyed with Marco Polo, real or embellished, through the Yuan dynasty, witnessing the potential fusion of Mongol nomadic traditions with established Chinese icecraft. Now, let the snow globe of time settle once more, and you find yourself drifting into the Ming Dynasty, 1368 to 1644 AD. The Mongols have been driven out, and a native Han Chinese dynasty is restored. There's a renewed focus on traditional Chinese culture, arts, and, of course, gastronomy. You're curious. What became of those imperial frozen delights? Did they vanish with the Khans, or did they adapt and continue to flourish? You're perhaps in Beijing, the grand capital re-established by the Ming emperors, or maybe in the elegant southern city of Nanjing, an auxiliary capital. The imperial court is, as ever, a place of intricate ritual and refined taste. And, in the sweltering summer months, the demand for cooling relief, for those exquisite iced dishes, remains undiminished. A mainstream historical fact is that the Ming Dynasty largely continued and built upon the sophisticated culinary traditions of the earlier Song and Tang periods, including the use of ice and the creation of elaborate desserts for the imperial household and the elite. The institutional memory of how to harvest, store, and utilize ice, honed over centuries, was certainly not lost. The ice houses were still maintained, the imperial chefs still tasked with creating delightful concoctions to please the Son of Heaven and his court. Imagine a Ming imperial banquet. The scene is one of opulent splendor. Richly embroidered silks, gleaming porcelain, the subtle scent of incense. And after numerous courses of meticulously prepared delicacies, servants in their prescribed livery bring forth the chilled or frozen desserts. What might they be serving? Perhaps refined versions of the fruit ices and sorbets known from the Song, now made with even more exotic fruits, some perhaps cultivated in the imperial greenhouses or brought as tribute from the furthest southern reaches of the empire. There would also be the milk-based desserts, perhaps known by names like Swan New Nai, sour cow's milk, or other terms for chilled or semi-frozen dairy concoctions, sweetened with fine sugar or honey, and delicately flavored with floral essences, vanilla, which was slowly making its way via traders, or precious nuts. One slightly unusual detail from the Ming era, or at least a more emphasized aspect, was the deep connection between food and traditional Chinese medicine. Flavors and ingredients were often chosen not just for taste, but also for their perceived health benefits according to principles of balancing yin and yang and the five elements. So, an imperial iced dessert might not just be a treat, it could also be subtly designed to cool the body in a harmonious way, to soothe summer heatiness, or even to aid digestion. A court physician might even have a say in the types of chilled dishes served, especially to the emperor. Your Majesty, I recommend the chilled pear and lotus seed soup today. It is excellent for pacifying liver fire and promoting tranquility. Perhaps skip the third helping of the deep-fried phoenix talons if you wish for optimal balance. It adds a layer of almost medicinal seriousness to enjoying your dessert. Is this ice cream delicious and good for my spleen? Excellent! The techniques for making these treats would have been largely the same. The use of ice and saltpeter mixtures to achieve freezing temperatures, the manual stirring or agitation to improve texture. However, with centuries of practice, the Ming chefs likely achieved a high degree of refinement. They would have understood intuitively how different ingredients affected the freezing process, how to balance sweetness and acidity, and how to present their creations in aesthetically pleasing ways. The emphasis was often on natural flavors and a certain subtlety, rather than overwhelming sweetness or artificiality. A continuing point of academic discussion revolves around the extent to which these practices influenced, or were influenced by, culinary developments in neighboring regions or even further afield during the Ming period. China was not an isolated entity. The Ming voyages of Admiral Zheng He in the early 15th century, for instance, reached as far as Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. While these were primarily diplomatic and tributary missions, they also facilitated cultural exchange. Did new fruits, spices, or even ideas about chilled beverages or desserts travel along these maritime routes? Conversely, did Chinese culinary practices, including their sophisticated use of ice, disseminate further? Tracing these subtle lines of influence is complex, as direct textual evidence specifically about frozen dessert recipes being exchanged is often scarce. However, it's plausible that the constant low-level hum of trade and cultural contact led to a gradual cross-pollination of culinary ideas across Asia and the Indian Ocean world. You can picture the imperial ice houses, perhaps located in a secluded part of the Forbidden City, still being filled each winter with massive blocks of ice, harvested with great effort from nearby lakes and rivers like Kunming Lake or the Tonghui River. The officials in charge of the Board of Works or similar imperial agencies would oversee this crucial task. The supply had to be sufficient not only for cooling drinks and foods, but also for preserving perishable tribute items and, of course, for creating those all-important frozen desserts that were such a part of imperial life. It was a year-round concern. Harvest in winter, store carefully through spring, and then dispense judiciously through the hot summer and autumn. Any failure in this chain could have serious consequences, at least for the comfort and mood of the emperor. A grumpy, overheated son of heaven was probably not a good thing for courtly harmony. Now, let's gently float forward once more into China's last imperial dynasty, the Qing, 1644 to 1912. This dynasty was founded by the Manchus, a people from northeast of the Great Wall. They adopted many Chinese customs and institutions, including, as you might expect, the sophisticated culinary traditions of the Ming court they replaced. The Qing emperors, particularly in their lavish summer palaces like the one at Chengde, Johor, or the Old Summer Palace, Yuanmingyuan, near Beijing, certainly enjoyed their share of iced delicacies. A mainstream historical fact is that during the Qing dynasty, particularly in the 18th and 19th centuries, there are more detailed accounts and even recipes for various types of iced dishes, including those that bear a closer resemblance to what we might call sherbets or water ices, and some milk-based frozen treats. For example, a dish called bing cha, literally iced tea, could refer to various chilled beverages, but sometimes also to frozen slushy concoctions. More significantly, there are references to nai luo, a traditional Beijing dairy dessert that can be served chilled or sometimes semi-frozen, often made with rice wine, honey, and nuts. While not exactly ice cream in the Western sense, it's part of this broader family of chilled, dairy-based treats. Some versions of nai lao or similar Manchu-influenced dairy puddings and custards were certainly served very cold, using stored ice. You're an observer in the sprawling grounds of the Old Summer Palace, a masterpiece of landscape design with its lakes, pavilions, and cool grottos. It's a hot afternoon. The Qianlong Emperor, perhaps, a great patron of the arts and a man of refined tastes, is taking his leisure. A servant approaches with a tray. On it is a delicate porcelain bowl containing a mounded, glistening dessert. It might be a fruit ice flavored with fresh peaches from the imperial orchards, or perhaps a richer, milk-based confection, subtly scented with jasmine. The emperor takes a spoonful, a moment of cool respite in the summer heat. The tradition, stretching back millennia, continues. The methods are still reliant on natural ice, painstakingly harvested and stored, and on the skill of imperial chefs.
A slightly more unusual detail that comes into focus during the Qing, especially as Western contact increased, is the Chinese observation of Westerners' own attempts at ice cream. In the later Qing, as more Europeans and Americans arrived in China as traders, missionaries, and diplomats, they sometimes brought their own culinary traditions, including their versions of ice cream, which by the 19th century was becoming more established in the West due to advancements in refrigeration and mechanical churners. There are some amusing, if occasionally condescending, accounts from both sides about these culinary encounters. Chinese officials might have been politely curious about these foreign ice creams, perhaps finding them overly sweet or strangely textured compared to their own more subtle iced dishes. Conversely, Westerners were often fascinated by the ancient Chinese methods of ice storage and their delicate fruit ices, though they sometimes missed the creamy richness they were accustomed to. Their iced plums are quite refreshing, though rather lacking in, well, cream Jenkins. And one does wonder about the camphor aftertaste in that yellow one. The academic debate about who invented ice cream often resurfaces when discussing this period. As we've seen, China had a very long and sophisticated tradition of frozen desserts. However, modern ice cream as we generally know it, a dairy-based product made creamy through a process of churning while freezing, often with eggs and a higher fat content, largely developed in Europe, particularly Italy and France, from the 16th century onwards possibly, as we discussed, with some early indirect inspiration from Asia via travelers like Marco Polo or through Middle Eastern sherbet traditions. By the 18th and 19th centuries, this Western-style ice cream was becoming distinct. So it's less about a single invention and more about parallel or intersecting lines of development. China was a pioneer in harnessing cold and creating a wide array of frozen treats from natural ingredients. Europe later focused more on the dairy-rich, churned product we now call ice cream. Neither negates the other. They are both fascinating parts of the global history of frozen deliciousness. You ponder the final decades of the Qing dynasty. The empire is facing immense internal and external pressures. Yet, within the walls of the Forbidden City and the imperial summer residences, some traditions persist. The imperial kitchens still prepare their chilled delicacies. The ice houses are still stocked, though perhaps with increasing difficulty as the empire's resources dwindle. The strange history of ice cream in imperial China is nearing its end, not with a bang, but with the slow melting of an ancient tradition in the face of a rapidly changing world. The arrival of industrial refrigeration technology in the 20th century would eventually render the massive, labor-intensive ice harvesting and storage systems obsolete even in China. And Western-style ice cream, with its commercial production methods, would eventually become popular globally. But the legacy of those ancient Chinese ice masters, those ice officials and imperial chefs, isn't entirely lost. It lives on in traditional Chinese chilled desserts and beverages that are still enjoyed today. It lives on in the historical records that tell of emperors savoring frozen milk and camphor, or court ladies delighting in jewel-toned fruit ices. It's a reminder that the human desire for a cooling treat on a hot day is universal, and the ingenuity displayed in fulfilling that desire long before the advent of modern technology is truly remarkable. From the earliest ice pits of the Zhou dynasty to the refined sorbets of the Tang and Song and the imperial dairy concoctions of the Ming and Qing, China has a rich, deep, and yes, rather strange and wonderful history with all things frozen and delightful. It wasn't always ice cream as we define it, but it was always a testament to human creativity and the pursuit of pleasure, even if that pleasure was, for a very long time, reserved for a very select few. And as the imperial era fades into the mists of history, as the grand palaces grow quiet and the last blocks of harvested winter ice melt away, you're left with a sense of the immense span of time the story covers. Thousands of years of innovation, of artistry, of battling the summer heat with the preserved chill of winter, all for the sake of a fleeting, frozen delight. Now, as the story of Imperial China's frozen treats gently concludes, let your mind become as still and cool as a freshly harvested block of winter ice, stored away in the deepest, quietest cellar of your consciousness. The journey through dynasties and flavors is over. The images of bustling Song marketplaces, serene Tang gardens, and opulent Qing palaces can begin to soften, their vibrant details merging into a peaceful, undemanding backdrop. Any thoughts of recipes, of saltpeter and ice, of emperors and their cravings can drift away like wisps of steam from a warm drink, or perhaps more fittingly like the last lingering coolness of a melted sorbet. Allow your body to settle more deeply into its resting place. Feel the support beneath you, a solid, comforting presence. The need to analyze, to learn, to even listen intently is fading. Your only task now is to embrace the quiet, the stillness that follows a story well told. Each breath is a gentle wave, washing away any remaining tension, carrying it out, and bringing in a sense of calm, cool refreshment. Imagine a light, cool breeze, like one coming off a snow-capped mountain in the distance, brushing softly against your skin, soothing and relaxing every muscle, every nerve. The delicate flavors of jasmine, lychee, or sour plum, once so vivid in our story, now just leave a faint, pleasant memory, a whisper of sweetness that lulls you further into tranquility. The world outside, with its demands and its pace, can recede. Here, in this quiet moment, there is only peace, only the gentle invitation to rest. Good night,